go way back in history, we started with evolution and we assumed that all life came from a common ancestor. But the story of the Earth happens, of course, much earlier than that. So Earth originally appeared as a dense sphere floating through the space about 4.5 billion years ago, as it formed from a hot mass of molten rock. Water from the Earth, or water came to the Earth as comets, which were much closer together and more frequently hitting Earth at the time. Comets are simply chunks of rock with lots of ice on them. So it's thought that there were a bunch of comets that hit Earth, and that is the source of the water which we have. The moon formed from a collision of a large protoplanet about 4 billion years ago. Now there are a few different theories about this, but the idea is that something hit Earth and it caused all this stuff to go up into space, which coalesced into what we now have as the moon, and it got captured in Earth's orbit. There we have it. All right, so then we pick up where life began around 3.8 and 3.5 billion years ago. As we've mentioned before, the oldest known fossils of prokaryotic organisms are found around this time. And it is thought that they occurred in environments similar to hydrothermal vents, which we find in the deep sea, or possibly the ocean's edge, which would have had conditions similar to this. At this point, the atmosphere had no oxygen in it, and Earth was probably much hotter than it is right now. The idea that somehow organisms coalesced around the things which are required for life, including DNA and a plasma membrane, and the things which allow life to exist somehow came together and made the first cell around this time. Now there's a lot more to this theory than just what's spoken here. And you may have heard of spontaneous generation. Louis Pasteur, who helped discover microorganisms, did an experiment where he boiled broth and disproved this theory as living things coming out of nowhere. Now, under the conditions which Pasteur made, yes, spontaneous generation is not possible. However, there are some experiments which show that perhaps the conditions similar to those in early Earth could have caused life to arise. So some of those experiments include Miller and Urey's experiments. They basically made this kind of closed system which approximated the conditions similar to Earth, had liquid and a bunch of minerals, had gas explosions, lightning simulated, and had this go through a bunch of different cycles, and they were able to, without any living thing being in there, produce 30 carbon compounds, including some amino acids and a nitrogenous base, adenine. So perhaps if this were allowed to continue over millions of years, you could approximate something that is similar to life. In the fossil record, we have Earth's living history or biology preserved. We are able to date those different types of fossils using half-lives of isotopes. Carbon dating is one of those, but we can use different elements to infer time periods much further back than carbon dating can. And again, our oldest known prokaryotic organisms in the fossil record appear about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, and those are some of the fossils that where they have been discovered. Now, eukaryotes came much later in the history. They first appear in the fossil record about 1.5 billion years ago. So approximately 2 billion years later, we get our first eukaryotes. Multicellular eukaryotes followed around 1 billion years after that. And multicellular organisms are now able to differentiate different parts of their bodies, which can specialize in different functions, and reproduce sexually and have sexual selection now a part of the evolution of organisms. Further yet, another 500 million years or so ago, animals and plants are established and radiate during a period of time called the Cambrian explosion. So now you get a lot of different phyla appearing first in the fossil record right around this same time. So some adaptations which allowed animals and plants to exist also allowed them to exploit a lot of different resources in their environment. Therefore, you have an explosion of diversity arising from this time period. The Earth itself has gone through many fluctuations, some of them cyclical, some of them we have never seen again, including warming and cooling, which causes water from the ocean to freeze or precipitate more as ice and form glaciers. We have changes in the Earth's atmosphere, including the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Like I mentioned before, early Earth didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere. We have changes in land masses, and that's what we have here. So this is Pangea, when all the continents were together, and it has the maps of countries, including, I put Buena Vista in this website, and it will pull up where in Pangea your address is. So you can see that's where Buena Vista would be if Pangea were still intact. These events led to many different extinction and evolution events and account for a lot of the different things that we see. So for example, we see a lot of marsupials restricted to Australia. Well, that must have occurred because of a separation of Australia from the rest of the continents, which mostly have placental mammals. Okay, so now we're going to talk about species again. So this is again a continuation of our macroevolution. The concept of a species must account for two different phenomena. First, the distinctiveness of species that occur at a single locality, so what makes one species different from another, and the connection that exists among different populations belonging to the same species. All right, so we've talked about species concepts, and they also help us understand these two questions, how populations interact with each other, and then how those populations can then become different species. Sympatric species, sim as meaning together, are species that occur in the same area. And there are lots of different species that occur in the same area. These species themselves can be thought of as distinct entities with different physical characteristics or different phenotypical expressions of their genes. They utilize different parts of the habitat. Another way of saying that is they have a different niche. They behave separately, and even if they look alike to us, they have to have some way in which to differentiate themselves from each other, right? So a gray squirrel does not mistake a red squirrel as one of its kind, and a groundhog, even though all of these are squirrels related somewhat, they are also distinct in their habitat use and genetics and their morphology and everything else. So ways that sympatric species can differentiate themselves: one can be they avoid mating with the wrong species in a variety of different ways. So we talked about these isolating mechanisms as well. So there can be visual signals, sound signals, pheromones, so some sort of chemical which is released by the individual, and or electrical signals, which may be important in areas where you can't see or hear very well. Subspecies is a relatively new concept that you have somewhat distinct populations that occur in different areas. There's still some interbreeding going on, but in these different populations, so they aren't considered separate species, but they do have differences in morphology. So, For example, subspecies of rat snake. They have a bunch of different colors. Here we have a black phase of the eastern rat snake and the yellow phase, and an intergrade, an area where they do coexist with both phenotypes. And so the thought is we have three different subspecies here in South Carolina, and they have different physical characteristics and are genetically somewhat distinct. So, and even though they physically look much distinct, often they have some amount of gene flow which connects them genetically. All right, species. Again, we've talked about different species concepts. Ernst Mayr was the first one who came up with this biological species concept, which separates species based on their ability to breed or actually not breed, and then produce fertile offspring. So reproductive isolation then is a mechanism, if populations can no longer breed, is a mechanism for speciation. All right, so when we are then can understand how species can be separated reproductively, this can also be a way for which they can descend into separate species, or sorry, populations to species. And cladogenesis is then where we can recognize where one species is divided into two descendant species. So if species are defined by the existence of reproductive isolation, then the process of speciation is identical to the evolution of those reproductive isolating mechanisms. So whatever, whether it's temporal or gametic or all those different ones that we talked about, has led to them being separate species. That's also part of their evolution, thus macroevolution. All right, selection may reinforce these isolating mechanisms. So you may get to a point where populations are separated. And then because they are separated, they are then in separate or distinct environments, and those environments can then further separate the species in the selection of traits in their environment. All right, and this is called reinforcement. This is not necessarily inevitable. You may have hybrids or an area where there is gene flow amongst the populations, and that could create fertile hybrids and thus allow for genetic exchange and gene flow. Genetic drift, is another way in which isolation can cause reproductive differences. So these, in review, remember genetic drift is when you have a smaller population from the larger population, and that thus creates a different variation in the alleles in that population. An example of this happening then leading to speciation is in the Hawaiian Islands. So there was a species of fruit fly, Drosophila, which probably came to similar to the mockingbirds and the finches of the Galapagos. It was a descendant from the mainland that probably first inhabited and then diversified into these different islands. And they, as they were on these different islands, there were changes in courtship behavior between these different populations as they became separated from each other, could have led then to their speciation. So that is one theory of how there are so many different species of fruit fly on these islands. All right, so as we mentioned, adaptation can reinforce separation. It can also lead to speciation itself. Because as environments are different and as populations then adapt to that environment, they're going to be accumulating specific traits which could be different from the other population. An example of this in anoles. These are types of lizards that live, some of them are in the United States, a lot of them are in tropical islands of the Caribbean, and each of them have different dewlap characteristics. The dewlap is the part that sticks out from their throat, which they use for mating behavior. So there's differences in color, in size, in whether it's spotted or patterned or other things like that. And those can match up with their environment. So they could be something which is camouflage in their environment, or actually in this case, it would be something that sticks out of their environment. If they're in an area that has lots of red flowers, then maybe a red dewlap would be selected against, and instead you would get something that contrasts that with dots or stripes or something like that. So this can then lead to reproductive isolation from an ancestral population. So speciation is generally a two-part process. We've kind of talked about this. Initially, a population has to diverge. And then from there, reproduction must be isolated to maintain the divergence. And then even when they go back, if they are somehow back in contact, they should still be reproductively isolated. But if there is ever gene flow between the two populations, that will then create genetics which will preserve the populations and still maintain a single species. It's more likely to occur when species are geographically isolated. That's just the easiest and simplest way to think about it. But that has a specific term which is called allopatric speciation. So this is speciation which occurs because of physical separation. All right, so an example of this, the little paradise kingfisher, it varies little throughout its whole range, but on some islands, it is very distinct in its different populations because of how the structure of the islands are. It separates populations. Okay, so allopatric speciation occurs. You have this one large population. Some geographic barrier arises, whether it be a river or a mountain, which isolates them, and that leads then to natural selection, selecting for different traits, and thus creating two separate species. Sympatric speciation, however, is a little more tricky. So this is the idea that two species that live together in the same area, or two populations that live together in the same area, can diverge and be separate species, even though they live together. So there must be something else other than geographical which can separate them. One possible mechanism might be polyploidy. Polyploidy in most animals can lead to sterility and inability to reproduce, but in plants it's much more frequent, and you can get individuals that are then creating distinct genetics and distinct populations that are still in the same area. So there are different types of polyploidy. Autopolyploidy is where all the chromosomes arise from a single species, so it's just one species, and some error in aneuploidy causes the production of tetraploids from diploids, and generally they cannot produce fertile offspring with normal diploids because they have different number of genetics, and the gametes would be triploid. So you then create two different populations, one's diploid and one's polyploid. Another type of allopolyploidy is where two species hybridize and they create perhaps a hybrid which is infertile. Well, that infertile hybrid could, as a plant, reproduce asexually, and then it might be possible that later you get a polyploid event, and that then makes it fertile, because just by doubling the chromosomes, now you have an even number, which allows you to make normal viable gametes. And we'll cover more about this in class. So it is thought one of the things that sympatric speciation might be impossible, but there may be other ways in which it could happen, including disruptive selection, which we've talked about before, is selection against the mean, which favors the extreme variance, right? And that would then diverge the population into two phenotypes. if those phenotypes then evolve reproductive isolating mechanisms, whether it's behavior, mechanical, gametic, whatever, then they could then be separating into different species. All right, and it is thought that the cichlid fishes of the Lake Victoria in Africa occurred through sympatric speciation. That they diverged in their selection for different feeding types, and then they were somehow reproductively isolated later, and then created all these diversity of species in the lake. All right, adaptive radiations. Okay, we actually have already talked about this with the fruit flies and the finches of the Galapagos, where a closely related species recently evolves all from a common ancestor by adapting to different parts of the environment. So this is an example from the book. These are honey creepers, which seem to all have come from a founder species. So the first species or population to colonize an area. And generally this happens on islands. Islands are great breeding grounds for speciation. They're generally far away from the mainland. They don't have a lot of diversity there already, and so a colonizing event could lead to speciation through adaptive radiation. They're also suspect to extinction events, and so that can open up niches for other organisms to adaptively radiate. Character displacement can also occur with adaptive radiation, where natural selection in each species favors those individuals that use resources not used by the other species. And this is, again, thought to have occurred with the finches of the Galapagos, where each population has a different specialization, whether in beak size would be the character, and that character then causes specialization on different resources. Okay, over time then that leads to speciation. Now we've talked a lot about then how different species can arise from different founder species, cladogenesis, things like that. It is thought that evolution can often occur in two different paces, meaning how frequent species occur. One is just gradual and consistent over time, that a species occurs, every 50 years as new adaptations and isolating mechanisms occur. The other thought is punctuated equilibrium, where there is a long period of pretty much stable number of species followed by rapid change, and it would appear that adaptive radiation and character displacement on islands probably had some of these punctuated times where all of these niches were open, and so a lot of evolution took place, and then it was kind of slow after that. All right, these are both two ends of a continuum, so neither one of them is the only way it works, but we can see evidence of each in the fossil record and in individuals and species that we see alive today. Okay, we're done.